Well, welcome back. It's time for week 4 assignments. This is LDR813, and no, that's not me. That appears to be somebody like a younger version of Tom Cruise, if I remember back. But we're going to be looking at the change in topics for this week. We're moving away from transformational and transactional leadership theory, and we're moving to a different style of theory, leadership style theory called charismatic. And as you'll see, there are some relationships between charismatic and transformational. And again, this is the way theories work, and this is the way literature development works. And so I think what you'll see is a way things start to tie together, and you'll start seeing more similarities than perhaps you might have thought existed between the various theories. So these are the required readings for the week, and there are obviously a lot more in the library, but this gives you a good start, gives you kind of a basis so we can talk about the underlying theory behind charismatic leadership, how it's been studied, what are various approaches that have been taken to define what it is, come up with the definitions. Of course, most of us have heard the word charisma before, and we associate this is going to be somehow related to people with charisma are going to be charismatic leaders. But of course, for academic purposes, that's a little too vague, and we can't use everyday common definitions when we try to study things, to get actually down to the facts and the realities of how things work. So this will get us started, and the discussion post will be, of course, about charismatic leadership theory and how it compares to transformational and transactional theories. So far the discussions have been going well. Again, the point is not to describe the theory. The point is to understand the literature and try to present it in a way that gives us something to talk about, a little more substance than simply describing what this article said and what that article said and what this theory is and what that theory is. So we're trying to get a little deeper into it now, and the more information that you've got about the various leadership style theories, the more you can say about it, the more you have to compare it to. Okay, so that's what we're looking for, both in the discussion posts and in the papers. But I think it would be good at this point to follow up on the dissertation process that I introduced in last week's lecture, because I said before you can get started, you really need to develop a stream of literature. In fact, you need to develop 2 streams of literature to identify a gap. And so I thought to advance that idea a little bit further, to talk about the distinction between bodies of literature and streams of literature. And sometimes these terms get confused and interchanged. And I think an important distinction is to look at bodies of literature as generally large conglomerations of literature that's developed over a period of time around a particular area. Now, in social sciences, of which business is a part, and psychology is part of it, and sociology and anthropology, and all these different fields involving human beings, those are the social sciences, excluding the medical field. That's not social science, that's the medical science. But in the social science, bodies of literature develop generally around well-accepted theories. For example, Porter's 5 forces theory, Bass's transformational leadership theory, Friedman's efficient markets theory. And after a period of time, if they're established and well-recognized, other people start to write about it. Some of those people may be writing from totally different fields. So in leadership, a lot of times we'll find some things written from the business community and published in business journals, but actually you'll find a lot of the leadership literature is coming out of psychology and social psychology and sociology, where people are coming from a different perspective and have a different body of research behind them. So it's important to understand that these bodies of literature around a particular topic can become enormous and will actually develop sub-bodies of literature, produce children, if you will, with new bodies of literature. And so if they've been around a long period of time, 20, 30, 40 years, then there's going to be a lot of literature, millions of articles, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So it's good to understand how this works, and it's good to understand, have a feeling of the theories that are embodied in a body of literature, but as a workable subject matter, it's impossible to say you know everything about millions of articles of literature, in a body of literature. You may have, as you develop and advance your career, you'll know more and more about it, but it's not a good starting point to actually start a research project such as a dissertation. What you need to do is learn how to develop a stream of literature from a body of literature that will be a particular selection of literature that relates to a particular topic that you want to work with. Generally starts with a foundational theory of some sort. So you may say, I want to start with transformational leadership, or I want to start with charismatic leadership, or I want to start with LMX theory, I want to start with something. So you start from someplace, but then you focus on a particular aspect of that theory that's going to be related to your research interest. So there's kind of an interaction between what you think you want to do, the area you want to work, and the literature. And as you work further and deeper into the literature, you may have to redefine exactly what it is you want to do with your research interest. So there's an interaction between both. But you don't start out saying, this is what I want to do my research on. Now I'm going to go searching around to see if there's any literature available. So your classes, particularly your concentration classes, are meant to expose you to the theories within a particular area that you're working in this case leadership. So you should be aware of the various leadership theories. You should have read some of the literature related to those particular theories, and as you start to think about what you might like to do for your own research project, you have now a wide variety of areas that you can start to work from. So once you start to develop the stream of literature, you're only going to be interested in literature related to that particular topic that you plan to work with. So you're going to look for things that create specific definitions of terms where the people writing or publishing are in general agreement about the definitions and what has been considered valid and somewhat proven. Okay, so you don't want to kind of go off on a tangent and start drawing in things that are not related or seem to disagree with the point you're trying to make. Okay, and the ultimate point of this, of course, is to lead to the research gap. What you're going to want to do your particular research question on, what you're going to try to prove that's new. Now, as I said in the discussion about the dissertation process, there's going to be two streams of literature required, two streams brought together, and as your research, you're going to show how those two streams can be connected together. Okay, but obviously to be able to do two streams, you have to be able to do one stream first. So let's get into a little more detail. So how do you start? Well, you need to have a general awareness of the literature in the field, and of course that's the purpose of the classes. You're developing an understanding of, in this class, of various leadership style theories. Then, as you start to develop an area of interest, you start to select the literature that's going to lead to the gap. Determine where you want to start, meaning what's considered the foundational literature. Do you want to go back to the beginning of time, or can you start at a certain point and say this is where this literature really starts to make sense, where people really start to agree on what they're doing? Then you determine how much related literature is required. As I said, sometimes people will be writing from outside the particular field, and you have to decide, is that relevant to what you're trying to do? How much do you need to show to prove that you understand the field from the different perspectives? Then finally, how narrow do you have to go? What's the most recent research in that particular area? So that will tend to narrow things down quite a bit. And then as you're writing, and this relates to writing your papers also, you have to determine the rationale for the stream. What's the logic that connects the particular stream together? How does it show a particular point that you're trying to make? How does it, in a way, what you're trying to do is validate or justify the research topic that you're working on. Why are you doing it? What's the basis in terms of the literature that's already been done that says this is a valid area to work? Why is particular literature being included? Why is some being excluded? And then how are they tied together? What's the logic? And this is what I tend to try to show you in the rubric for the papers, is that things have to tie together. You have to be making a point. You have to be showing the logic between the ideas that you're presenting, and they have to be related and based upon the literature that you're reading. Okay, so let's look at it a little bit differently. So here's steps 1 and 2. First thing we have to do is we have to start with a general awareness of the field, and that's what we're doing now. These little smiley faces represent all the different theories of leadership. So we've got great man theory and traits theory, behavioral theories. we have contingency theories, we have transactional theories, we have transformational theories, we have servant theories. This week we'll be looking at charismatic theories. So there's a whole bunch of different leadership theories. There's no shortage of theories in the leadership area. The problem is, what are you going to work with? You can't work with all of them. You have to choose something. So let's just say that based upon your general awareness of the literature, that you decide you're going to use something called leadership competency theory, which is one of the more modern developments out of all these previous theories. So that's going to be your general area. That's going to be the theory area that you're going to work with. Okay, so now you've got it. Now, where do you want to start when you're developing your literature stream? What is the foundational theory for competency theory? Well, if you trace it back, you'll see that competency theory for leadership is based on trait-based leadership literature and behavioral-based leadership literature. Okay, and that was developed kind of back in the late 1940s and early 1950s by Roger Stougdill and White and McClelland and Boyetts and Bentz. These are the kind of foundational authors that at that point decided or found out by, reading the literature and basic new ideas that there was actually things about leadership you could study scientifically as opposed to simply projecting your own ideas about it. So now you've got your foundational literature. Now you know where you're going to start your literature stream. Now you need to determine how much related literature is required, meaning you've got to look at what's currently being done with leadership competency theory. How are the different models being applied? What kind of studies have been done? What are the definitions of competencies? Which things are considered competencies, which aren't? So you can move forward in the literature and kind of trace how it evolved from the early theories to the more modern theories, okay? But again, you have to kind of keep narrowing it down. You don't want to cover everything. You have to figure out what's the specific thing you're trying to prove. So you'll start reading Sulzer and Thornton and McClelland still publishing, Bray, and this will lead you more into the more current theories regarding leadership competencies. But now you've got to start narrowing it down, because even when you start looking at leadership competencies, you'll find that this is a body of literature and you want a stream. So you've still got to start pulling out things that are focused on what you plan to do. So at this point you have to say, well, what am I going to do? What am I trying to show? And suppose you decide that you're going to try to show that there's a relationship between competency theory and leadership style theories, specifically transactional and transformational theories. Okay, so you're pulling two different areas of leadership research together. Those are going to be your two streams, and you're going to try to show somehow that there's a relationship between these two. So that starts to focus down what you're actually interested in. And now you've got to determine why is certain literature being included and why is other literature being ignored, because you're not going to cover everything. So you're only interested in literatures that are related to competencies and how these competencies affect a leader's ability to execute a particular style. Okay, so now when you're doing your searching in the library, you're looking for specific articles. You're looking at the articles that you already have, and you're looking at the reference list and seeing where those authors drew their information from. So now you're starting to focus in. Then, when you've got the literature, now you need to tie it together. What is the connecting theme? How does the articles relate to each other, and how do the articles relate to the research topic or the gap that you're going to be trying to work with? And I suggest for this purpose and also for your papers, you start with a thesis statement that says what you're trying to do. For example, this stream will show that leadership competencies theory provides a proven model for determining specific demonstrated attributes of leaders. Then build a logical flow from earlier literature to the current literature, and that'll provide one leg of your supporting literature for your research question. Again, you'll have to come up with the other stream of literature, which is going to come out of leadership style theory, and you may end up with something not refined enough, but in the general vein of, is there a relationship between leadership competency theory and leadership styles of transactional and transformational leadership? So you can see how we started out with a very broad perspective, and now we've, through the working between the research question and between the available literature, we start to focus in on exactly what we're looking for and that'll help define the literature stream and what should be included and what shouldn't, and also the definition of exactly what the gap is going to be and what the hypotheses are going to be, and the kind of testing that's going to be necessary and data that's going to be required to be able to prove that there is a relationship or there's not a relationship. So that's how it develops. It comes from an interaction between the literature and the research topic. So to show just how this works on a general basis, if you go into Google Scholar, and I recommend before you do any literature searches in the library, go to Google Scholar, because there's a lot more literature there and you can get to it much more quickly than trying to find it in the library. Once you found out what's there, then you can start looking in the Kaiser Library or other online databases to try to find the actual articles. But suppose you type in to Google Scholar leadership theory. You'll come up with about 2.5 million results. So that's a pretty big body of literature related to this, and you wouldn't want to try to use leadership theory as your stream of literature. So let's try to break it down. You focus on transformational leadership theory. Here you get a smaller return, about 129,000. Still quite a few, and probably a little bit broader than you want to work with. How long would it take you to read 129 and catalog 129,000 articles? So you decide, well, I'm not so interested in all the leadership theory stuff. I'm going to look at the MLQ, which is the instrument that provides the data about assessment of whether a leader is using a transformational leadership style or not. So there, if you search on MLQ, you get 28,000, almost 29,000 hits. So that's too much. You're going to focus it down now and ask about MLQ effectiveness. Well, this again cuts that more than in half, and now you get 13,600. But you still think, well, that's quite a few. I've got to narrow it down even further. So I'll try leadership effectiveness studies, which would be the studies that actually have used the MLQ and looked at its effectiveness. Here you get 12,800. Still seems like too much. So now you look at MLQ alternatives. What could you use for judging transformational leadership but not use the MLQ? Well, here, now we're starting to hit pay dirt. Now we've got about 8,500, which again shows that we're kind of zeroing in on a target, and so our research question and our gap would be taken from this and refined even further. But this shows you the idea that you can't work with big, broad topics. You have to be very focused, otherwise there's no way to develop your literature stream. So the keys to success. When you're looking at the different theories and reading the literature, we want to be comparing and contrasting. We want to be seeing the similarities and where they're different. Remember, we're still talking about leadership, which is generally, identified as, we know leadership. We can identify it when we see it. So then the question is, well, what are we identifying? What specifically are we looking at? And that's where the academics take over, because they say, we have to point out what it is that we think is leadership. We have to define it. We have to be able to measure it. We have to get some sort of consensus of agreement. So the theories will have some underlying DNA, because essentially they're trying to answer kind of the same question. So that's your job when you're reading the literature. You're thinking, well, how does what I'm reading this week about charismatic leadership, how does it relate to what I've read before about transactional leadership and transformational? And if you've taken other classes, you might be thinking about it in terms of trait theory. You might be thinking of it in terms of behavioral theory. You might be thinking about it the Michigan studies and the Ohio State studies. So all these things are related together. There will be divergent viewpoints where people will disagree with somebody else in terms of their interpretation or their definition. We expect that. That's the way it works. And you may feel like it's impossible to cover all this, and that's why I suggest that you kind of start focusing in rather than trying to cover everything. Pick something that you think you'd be interested in, that you might be able to work with, and then focus on that. And it is take time, but the more you learn, the easier this will become. So we're going to be using previous information. All this is tied together. I designed the classes to be somewhat comprehensive, and everything can be utilized from 1 week to the next. And also, as you realize, this is week 4. By the time we're finished with this week, we'll have been halfway through the class. We've accomplished quite a bit. We're making good progress. So it's time to put on those dancing shoes and show us what you got. So until next time, goodbye and good luck.